For Session Update, I'm Shannon Loehrke. As the 2016 legislative session has been ramping up, I've had the opportunity to sit down individually with the Senate leadership to talk about their priorities for this session. Welcome, Senator Bakk.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on with you.
Tell me, what are your top 3 priorities this session?
Well, today is going to be our second day in our temporary home here in the new Senate office building. We've set up a temporary chamber for this session. First time since 1905 that the Senate hasn't met in the Capitol during the legislative session. So it's quite a historic time, and it's interesting that the very first bill we're going to take up in this, our temporary chamber in the new Senate building is a bill to provide extended unemployment benefits for the laid off mining industry people on the Iron Range to give them an extension once their benefits have expired. So the first thing we're dealing with is an emergency of economic nature. So our intent is to do that today. That was the first thing I wanted to get done this session. So we're going to send that over to the House. My hope is that this afternoon they'll take it up and pass it, and the governor have it signed into law by the end of the week.
So there's been a little bit of disagreement over that, about whether it was a clean bill or a not clean bill. The Republicans wanted to put in a tax cut for the unemployment insurance, which it has a really large surplus of over $1 billion. Why isn't that okay?
Well, the challenge with that, and I'm actually meeting with the deed people and the commissioner and the unemployment division this morning before we go into session to talk about that tax cut provision that the House was carrying. The challenge is we haven't taken it through any of our committees. It's a major change.
Okay.
And the other part that's challenging, and I'm not saying we're not going to do it, we may well end up doing it and may do it sooner rather than later. But the challenge with linking it to an emergency bill is the precedent that it sets. We've got an emergency piece of legislation that needs to pass, and there's some risk from a precedent standpoint that people start leveraging and hooking things on to something that's an emergency. So that's what concerns me in all the special sessions we've had during my time here. When we've dealt with emergency or disaster type legislation, no one's ever tacked anything on as a condition of support. So I really don't want to be the leader that for the first time says it's okay to tack something that someone else wants onto a kind of a must-pass emergency bill. So I think we're probably going to do both this year. I'm hoping the unemployment extension gets done today. And if in the very near future, I believe we've got a bill being drafted for the tax piece that the House Republicans have wanted to do. We'll take that through the regular committee process. I know it's got to go to Senator Thomasoni's Economic Development Division. It's got to go to the Senate Tax Committee. The changes in there are very, very important because if we lower tax rates too much to try and avoid surpluses and we hit a recession, what ends up happening is it automatically triggers federal borrowing. And then employers end up with a surcharge on their unemployment tax bill every month when they pay their unemployment tax in. So we never want to get into a situation where we're borrowing money from the federal government. So we got to be a little bit cautious to make sure that we keep our fund in Minnesota healthy.
Can you talk a little bit about transportation? That's been in the news a lot lately.
Well, and the governor mentioned it last night in his State of the State. I was very pleased about that. Our transportation infrastructure all around the state is in pretty disrepair, and it's not going to fix itself. And there was a study done recently that indicated that, and I think there's general agreement between everybody around the Capitol, that it's going to take about $600 to $700 million a year for the next 10 years, each year, in order to get our transportation infrastructure restored to the level that we expect it to operate at.
So how do you want to fund that? Through a gas tax or some other kind of tax?
Well, the Senate actually is considering a hybrid proposal. I think what's important, well, first let me say I'm appointing conferees today to both the tax bill and the transportation bill. Those are the 2 bills that didn't get done last session. So we're going to, it's called reconstitute the conference committees. So we're going to put those 2 conference committees back to work. It's actually a pretty big advantage this year having already have the bills pass the House and the Senate and already in conference. It gives us a real head start on getting to work on a potential tax bill and a potential transportation bill. My number one priority as it relates to transportation is that we don't just do some kind of Band-Aid, that we maybe take a couple $100 million of the surplus and sprinkle it around on a couple of road projects. That's not a transportation plan. I really want to come out of this session with a long-range transportation plan that addresses the needs for the next decade. And there's not adequate money in the state's general fund to be able to spend $600 to $700 million a year over the next decade. We'll be running deficits.
Right.
So what we need to have is some new money, and it needs to be dedicated specifically for transportation. So that means the new money would go into the Highway Trust Fund, constitutionally dedicated. So there are currently 3 streams of money that go into the Highway Trust Fund that can only be spent on transportation spending. And they are the gas tax, the license tabs on your vehicles when you buy license tabs, and something we call the motor vehicle sales tax. So it's the sales tax that you pay when you buy a car. Those streams of revenue automatically go to the Highway Trust Fund that can be spent on nothing but transportation purposes. So we're willing to talk about any one of those 3 pieces in some kind of a combination. It doesn't all have to be gas tax, but there needs to be some new money. Because otherwise, if we were to try commit just general fund money to this transportation, you can never bind the next legislature. That's one thing you learn here pretty early. This legislature is going to be done on May 23rd. We're all going to go home. We call it sine die, and we'll be done. And then the voters will elect a new legislature next November. And they're going to come to the Capitol next January with their priorities. And they'll be, the most current priorities of Minnesotans when they voted in the November 2016 election. And priorities change. And putting transportation in and saying it's our priority this year, and it may well be, but will it be the next legislature's priority? Or will schools be more important, or nursing homes be more important, or higher education be more important, or health care, or early childhood? It's very hard for transportation to compete in the general fund because those kind of investments can always be delayed. So that's why we've never used general fund money for transportation purposes. At least sporadically we have when we've had some money we have, but as a long-term plan we've always depended on the Highway Trust Fund that's constitutionally dedicated.
Last night in the State of the State, the governor spoke again of racial disparity in the state of Minnesota. And back when there was talk of a special session, there was talk of relief for Iron Range workers along with racial disparity. What is your caucus planning to do this session to address the racial disparities in the state?
Well, I was really pleased to hear the governor raise that last night, and it's actually about more than just racial disparities. It's largely that, I think, but there are places all around the state where there are significant economic challenges, and it's more than just people of color that are having trouble economically for their families. So the governor, way back last summer, announced he was creating a new office at the Department of Economic Development, the Office of Economic Assistance or Economic Disparities, and I think that was going to go into effect on March 1st. So I'm looking forward to his budget to see what he's going to put in that, and it will be a place I envision where nonprofits and other groups that have ideas out in the community how to start to make some headway in resolving these issues, kind of some innovative ideas, I hope, that come from the community. I don't think we can solve this problem at the Capitol. I think it has to be solved back in the community where the challenges are. And I think ideally by the people that live there, that really passionately care about improving the quality of life in their community. So I'm looking forward to trying to make some money available for people to come forward with ideas, and because it'll work best in the community if the community takes ownership of kind of improving everybody's quality of life. So also in addition, Senator Dietzig, Senator Hayden, and Senator Champion have been doing a lot of work on this. They were on the working group last fall and into almost Christmas that we're meeting to talk about these issues, and I know they've been working on a number of proposals that will be starting to move through the committee process, and ultimately will pass the Senate, and we'll link it up with what the governor's got, and in conference committee with the House. I'm pretty hopeful that we're going to come out with something, but this isn't a problem that just came upon us. It's been building for decades, and it's not something we're going to flip the switch and fix in this biennium. But they often say, and it was the class motto when I graduated from high school, I think. Our class motto was, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of how I think of this. This is a long-term issue, I think, but we got to start to figure out how we can make some headway.
Another issue of disparity that resonates with me has to do with broadband, because I'm a small town girl, and I grew up with seeing the city kids on the TV and all the stuff that they had, and we didn't have so much. And so there's a lot of people in greater Minnesota who don't have fast internet, things like that, things that connect you to the world in the information age. And I know the governor has spoken repeatedly on broadband. Do you also support that?
Yes, I think the challenge is, I think the governor has got $100 million in his bonding bill for that. There's kind of two things. The governor's bonding bill is about $1.4 billion. I actually support a bill of that size. I actually would like it to be a little bigger. And the Senate bill, maybe. I don't know where the House is going to land, so it just is, our ability to be able to commit to the governor's number is going to be dependent on kind of what number can we come in on in an agreement with the House on a final bill. But it's critical infrastructure. We wouldn't have electricity in rural areas if it had not been for rural electrification that came, because the private industry would have never done it because it didn't economically make sense. And I think that's the case with this infrastructure too. So it's going to have state participation. The good news is I think the state's getting about $85 million a year of federal money for the next 10 years. So a significant amount of federal money coming into Minnesota that's going to the carriers that, private carriers that currently serve people. So I think one of the challenges, and I met with the director of the Minnesota Broadband Office. She's actually a constituent of mine. She's from Grand Marais, and she commutes to St. Paul every week, about making sure that whatever money the state can put in just doesn't displace federal money. That there ought to be some way for us to commingle or build out different areas so that we're not getting overlapping coverage where state money is not maximizing the federal money. So, and she agrees with that. I've had this conversation with the governor. The governor agrees with that. I don't think we know exactly what that looks like yet, but we certainly want to maximize the federal money that's available also.
So one last question for you today. Mining is in the news a lot, and you represent the Iron Range, and so how do you balance jobs for Iron Range workers and also the environmental impact that mining has on the region?
Well, nobody cares about the environment in northern Minnesota than those of us that live there. And I just want to remind my Metro colleagues of that. I live on a lake in northern Minnesota. I've got grandchildren that come up and swim on my beach. Nobody cares more about that water than I do. I live there. My grandkids swim there. And so, but there is a way that we can do responsible mining and still protect water. We've been mining iron ore in northern Minnesota since 1881, 135 years. And I would bet you that most people that come to the Iron Range and play on our lakes think, wow, what a wonderful place. And so we've done a pretty good job for 135 years. And we're going to do even a better job going forward. I'm sure we are, because technologies have changed. So mining and a clean environment can coexist. The challenge is, it's an extraction business, so it changes the landscape. So it's important that you have strong reclamation, so that when areas are mined out, that they're reclaimed and reforested or replanted. But some of the Iron Range is going to be a magnificent place someday, because we're making new lakes. And we're making some big ones. I mean, the big U.S. Steel pit is going to be 20 miles long when mining is done, 1,000 feet deep. There aren't lakes like that any place. So someday it's going to be an incredible water resource. So what's important is that when areas get mined out, we do the adequate reclamation of it, so that it's available. It can be kind of repurposed, I think, for recreation going forward. And we'll never live to see it. My grandkids might live to see some of it, or my great-grandchildren. It'll be a magnificent countryside someday, and someday no one will know mining ever happened there, because they're going to all fill with water. So it can coexist, but companies are more sensitive to the environment than they ever have been. That's what the public demands, and that's what I demand as the leader of the Senate. So we'll get there. Let me just say the final thing that I really appreciated what the governor said last night. is he listed his number one priority is the financial stability of the state.
Yes, he did.
And I'm not going to say what my number one thing is, I guess, because I feel really strongly about moving the state forward on family medical leave for families. Workplaces have changed. We have more and more two-wage earner members in families.
And women in the workforce that would traditionally have stayed home to care.
Than we historically have. But workplaces haven't changed enough. And so more needs to happen to make those workplaces family friendly. And I think of it not only for parents that have young children, but just recently I had to take my mother to the Mayo Clinic for back surgery.
Right.
And I took time off work to do that.
Right.
But not everybody has the luxury of being able to do that. And so workplaces need to become more flexible to meet the needs of families, especially with so many of us baby boomers moving into retirement.
Yes, there are a lot of you.
We're going to start to depend on our kids some. And so
your kids are going to be stretched because they're going to have their own children and their parents to care for.
Really important priority to me. But I do appreciate the governor's comments about structural stability, because I went through a period, my first 7 years in the legislature, we cut taxes every single year. And along came 2002. And when Governor Plenty was elected, he was facing over a $4 billion deficit because the pendulum swung back too far. And for more than a decade, we managed deficits, and it was really hard. We used every kind of accounting gimmick that you could imagine to try to keep the state's budget in balance, and managing crisis after crisis after crisis. And what was interesting is over that period of time, we learned that early childhood spending is important. And the brain development that happens in those early years of life is just astounding. And much of that research was done by the University of Minnesota. When I came to the legislature, we didn't even have an early childhood committee. We didn't know. So along came 2002, shortly after we learn about early childhood, and I mentioned about the public's changing priorities. That's a new priority for people. But when we were managing deficits for more than a decade, I think there was general agreement we should spend some money on early childhood. But we never could, because we were always managing a crisis. So I think the governor's comment on financial stability is really, really important. That we don't overcommit this year on the spending side or on the tax cut side, so that we come back here next year and find ourselves staring down the barrel of another deficit. And we can't invest in things that all of us have learned are important.
Right, so continue to invest in Minnesota's future. Senator Bakk, thank you for joining me today, and I wish you a great session.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching an interview with Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk about his priorities for the 2016 legislative session. Senate Minority Leader David Hann also paid a visit to the studio to discuss his caucus's perspectives on the upcoming session. The February forecast came out on Friday, and it showed $300 million less than previous projections. Has this changed your priorities, and what are your top 3 priorities?
Well, no, it really hasn't changed our priorities. I think for our caucus, the number one thing that we are interested in is looking at the tax structure that Minnesota has. We think this is a great opportunity to do some real tax reform, tax reduction. Our members have introduced bills to look at returning some of the money to seniors. We kind of double tax Social Security benefits. We're one of the few states that do it. We think we can address that, maybe phase it out over a period of time. I think our bill does call for a phase out, but kind of so you can scale it to how much money you have available to do that. But no, I think tax relief is our top priority. We'd like to see something done to help the state economy to grow. That was one of the things in the forecast that was troubling to us, is that we haven't been performing recently as well as, say, the average across the country. We've seen a little bit of slowdown, wage growth, and economic activity. We think that our tax climate is an impediment to that. We'd like to see some change. So that is our top priority. We still think the plan to do something long-term with transportation by taking existing tax revenues and dedicating them is top priority. And I think those are the top 2 things. Obviously, there's going to be a bonding bill as well, and we're going to work on that.
So you recently said, I think just last week, no long-term commitments, and then later on the governor said that he felt transportation would require ongoing commitments. Right. Is there room to reconcile those 2 points of view?
Well, I think the long-term commitments that if you take and dedicate by statute existing revenues, say from the sales taxes on automotive issues, which is the plan that Republicans have proposed last year, That's as long-term a commitment, I think, as you can get. I think Democrats have talked a lot about increasing the gas tax structure in some way. We just don't think that this is the right time to burden the economy with another $1 billion or $2 billion of new taxes when we have the opportunity to take revenues that were coming into the state that are not being used right now. They're outside the budget, they're the surplus monies, and at least saying we should put some of that money toward long-term transportation issues, funding our infrastructure across the state. It's Metro as well as Greater Minnesota, and we think we can do that, and that is a top priority for our caucus.
And the 2 points of view, it's really just a philosophical difference in whether you're going to use the surplus money to pay for transportation or use sort of ongoing commitments like a gas tax or something that would continue to pay for it long term.
Well, I think that the idea that we need another tax on top of, we just had a huge tax increase a couple of years ago that we felt was unnecessary. I think the fact that we've been generating these excessive surpluses is evidence, at least in our opinion, that is the case, that we are overtaxing the economy. And then to add on top of that another tax, especially something like a gasoline tax, which is so sensitive to people's personal budgets, that this isn't a wise time to do it. Yes, right now gas prices are low, but we know they're not going to be low forever. They will rise, and the way this tax is structured, it will go up as the price of gasoline increases. We think it makes sense to take existing tax revenues from sales taxes and say, let's just dedicate those by statute to say these should be funds dedicated to road and bridge maintenance. That is, we think, the way to do this. And it would represent a departure because we are talking about taking money that otherwise would go into the general fund to be used for other things and use it for transportation, which up to this point we have very few dollars really in the general fund that is being used for transportation.
So with regard to tax relief, do you have some ideas to specifically target lower and middle income, or are you just interested in broader based tax relief?
Well, we've talked about a couple of things. Our caucus has been on board for dealing with the Social Security tax. As I said, we're one of the few states that do it. We do think that it makes a lot of sense. Our population is aging. We would prefer to have those people stay in Minnesota, continue to spend their money, do all the great things that senior people do, not chase them out of town because we're double taxing their benefits. We've also had a bill to deal with veterans' pension monies. Again, one of the few states that taxes veterans' pensions. We'd like to have veterans from Minnesota come back and stay in Minnesota, but right now that's a little bit of an impediment. There's also talk about just trying to, can we do anything to lower the general tax burden across the state, whether it's across the board income tax reduction. There's been talk about dealing with the statewide business property tax, which has got an automatic inflation escalator attached to it. These are all things. I mean, we're open to a lot of different ideas, and we think this is a good time to think about it because we've got this surplus. We are overtaxing. We do have a concern about the growth in the economy. Lowering our tax burden is going to help our economy to grow, and we need to do that.
So you've always worked on education. Education has been a priority for you.
Top priority.
Even though this is not a budget year, are there some education reforms that you'd like to see put forward? Yeah,
we've introduced bills. Our caucus has a number of them. I've got a couple myself, but we think that we talk a lot about the need to make our education system work better, and we've struggled with this achievement gap and low graduation rates. And it isn't a question of money. It is a question of structure and decision making, where decisions are made. We visited a school in North Minneapolis, North High School, last week. They're doing a wonderful job. But part of the secret, in my opinion, is that they've created a structure that is very close to the parents of the kids that they serve. They're a magnet school right now. I think in the process of changing that over time. But the point is that it is a structure issue, and the question is, do you have the ability to make good decisions? Can parents make meaningful decisions with their kids and with their schools? And if you don't have that, it's very, very tough. And part of the problem I think we have is we've got a very heavy bureaucratic structure. Unfortunately, we've got a employment union, the teachers union, that has extraordinary influence in these things. And we need to restore the ability of local school boards and parents to be involved in decision making. So we have some bills to get at that. We've got an educational savings account bill, for example, that sort of writes a grant to parents who have kids with special needs so that they can use that money in ways they see fit. It's worked very well in Arizona. They've had this for a couple of years now. They just passed it, more broader education savings account out in Nevada, I believe, just last year. So these are ideas that get at that structural reform that we think is critical to solving some of the problems. And we could do that without really spending money. It's more of a policy choice than a money choice. And we hope we get a chance to have that debate this year.
And finally, the first ever Minnesota Water Summit, was this weekend, Governor Dayton's water quality initiatives. Has your caucus talked about this at all?
Well, we've talked a little bit. Obviously, water quality, big issue for everybody in Minnesota. We're a state with a lot of water. We take pride in that. And I think there are some issues. I'm not an expert by any means. I know in some cases cities feel challenged because water quality standards have been raised, and all of a sudden the infrastructure that they built is, sort of out of code, if you will, and so now they're faced with, well, what do we do about that? I think we need to look at what is reasonable, what is doable. The governor has proposed $1.4 billion in bonding. We think that is excessive. We've already got $1.2 billion that we have already approved from previous years that's sort of out there waiting to be done, waiting to be let. For various reasons, we haven't even gotten the process of letting those bonds out. To add another $1 billion to that queue, in our opinion, doesn't make sense. So we're trying to figure out in our caucus what are the priorities and what is the appropriate size of a bonding bill that will address the top priorities that we need to make and not add another $1 billion, which does have, frankly, corresponding debt load attached to it, and there's some concern about that as well.
Right.
So,
though interest rates are low now, and it's supposedly a good time to borrow.
Well, that is true, but
Yeah.
it's still spending money, and
Yes.
we have a constitutional obligation to take care of the capital investments that we've made as a state. All of us are committed to doing that. It's really a question of what is the right way to get it. I think in many cases, unfortunately, bonding is looked at as sort of a Christmas tree, if you will, where everybody says, well, I can get this in, I can get that in, and then in an election year especially, you go home and say, hey, I got money to do this thing here or this thing here. I don't know that that's really the right way to do bonding. We ought to be focused on what are the top priorities for the state, things that have regional significance. That's what our Constitution calls for. That's what we're going to be working at.
Well, Senator Hann, thank you so much for stopping by today. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
You bet.